She is standing in a Nevada Justice of the Peace's office, and she is not wearing white. The year is 1954, and even here, even now, she is following a script nobody handed her. To understand why a runaway bride in 1950s America still followed rules, you have to understand what post-war America was trying to recover. The Second World War had scrambled everything. Courtships were rushed, weddings were improvised in church basements, and young women married men they had known for 3 weeks before a troop ship pulled out of harbor. By 1950, the country was not relaxing. It was snapping back. Hard. The social codes that returned were not gentle suggestions. They were a collective exhale of a society that had lived through too much disorder and was determined never to look chaotic again. When we talk about a runaway bride in the 1950s, we are actually talking about two very different women, and the rules each one followed were not the same. The first was the eloper, the woman who slipped away quietly and married in secret, usually in another town or state, without the ceremony her family had planned or expected. The second was the canceller, the woman who had announced her engagement, accepted her gifts, perhaps already ordered her dress, and then called the whole thing off. Both women were considered runaways, both were considered scandalous, but the etiquette that governed each one was entirely distinct. In 1950, the median age at which an American woman married for the first time was 20.3 years old. By 1956, that number had dropped to a record low of 20.1. Think about what that means for a moment. The average American woman was walking down the aisle before she was old enough to order a drink at a bar. The pressure behind that number was immense and came from every direction at once. From mothers who feared their daughters would be left behind, from a post-war economy that rewarded the two-income household, and from a culture that treated an unmarried woman in her mid-20s as a quiet social emergency. Here is the thing that modern culture tends to forget about the 1950s woman. She had very few portable assets. She could not always own property in her own name without difficulty. Her career options were narrow. Her financial independence was limited, but her reputation was entirely hers, and it traveled with her everywhere she went. It preceded her into a new town, into a new social circle, into a new marriage. A woman's good name was not vanity. It was infrastructure. It was the thing that determined whether her children would be welcomed into the right schools, whether her husband would be trusted by the right people, whether she herself would be received with warmth or with a certain careful distance. In 1952, Amy Vanderbilt published her Complete Book of Etiquette, and it became something close to a legal document for middle-class American social life. Vanderbilt was not gentle. She was precise, authoritative, and utterly unapologetic about the standards she set. Her book ran to nearly 700 pages and covered everything from how to address a senator's wife to the exact protocol for handling a broken engagement with, as she put it, absolute dignity and zero public emotion. Women bought it, gifted it, and kept it on the kitchen shelf next to the joy of cooking. It was not a book you read once. It was a book you consulted the way you consulted a doctor. 2 years before Vanderbilt's book arrived, Emily Post had already weighed in. Her 8th edition, published in 1950, was the reigning authority on broken engagements, and its language was specific enough to leave no room for improvisation. Post addressed the canceled wedding not as a tragedy, but as a social transaction that required precise handling. Every gift was to be returned. The engagement ring was to go back to the groom, and the announcement, when it was made, was to be worded in a particular way that communicated composure rather than collapse. Post's genius was that she treated scandal like a dinner party, something that, with the right preparation, could be managed without anyone losing their dignity. One of the most practical reasons a 1950s bride became a runaway bride was simply the cost of the alternative. A traditional post-war wedding for a middle-class American family ran between $500 and $1,500. That was not a trivial sum in 1952. By contrast, a couple who drove to Las Vegas could walk into the Little Church of the West, pay a chapel fee of $10 to $15, obtain a marriage license for $5, and be legally married before lunch. The arithmetic was not lost on practical young women who had grown up watching their parents scrimp and save. The white dress and the reception hall were beautiful, but they were also, in the plainest terms, expensive. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the math pointed somewhere specific. By the early 1950s, a Levitt townhouse on Long Island could be purchased for roughly $10,000. Young couples who were serious about building a life together looked at the numbers and made a quiet decision. A one-day parlor reception with a rented hall, a catered dinner, a 3-tiered cake, and 100 guests could consume a significant portion of a down payment. The runaway bride who eloped was not always fleeing something. Sometimes she was running toward something, a house, a mortgage, a future that felt more solid than a single afternoon of white tulle and borrowed silver. Modern culture tends to picture the 1950s runaway bride as a teenage girl in bobby socks, sneaking out a window to elope with the boy her father disapproved of. That image is mostly fiction. Many of the women who eloped in the post-war decade were in their early 20s, fully employed, and making a deliberate financial calculation. They were not rebelling against their parents so much as negotiating with them. Some families privately encouraged a quiet elopement precisely because it spared everyone the expense and the planning. The scandal, such as it was manageable. The debt from a lavish reception was not. To understand where the 1950s runaway bride rules came from, you have to go back one decade further. During the Second World War, the United States saw a massive spike in rushed, improvised marriages. A soldier received his orders on a Tuesday and was on a troop ship by Friday. If he and his sweetheart wanted to marry before he shipped out, they married in whatever time they had, in whatever setting was available, wearing whatever they owned. Etiquette authorities of the day quietly permitted what they called furlough brides to set aside the usual requirements. White gowns in church basements, no engagement announcement, no formal reception. The rules bent because the times demanded it. When the war ended and the men came home, something interesting happened to American social codes. They did not simply return to where they had been in 1939, they tightened. The years of improvisation, of making do, of bending every rule because the world was on fire, had created a deep collective hunger for order and predictability. Post-war etiquette was stricter than pre-war etiquette in many ways precisely because chaos had been so recent and so vivid. The rules around elopements and canceled weddings that Amy Vanderbilt and Emily Post codified in the early 1950s were not a continuation of tradition. They were a deliberate reconstruction of it. Let us talk about the dress, because the dress was not optional. Emily Post and Amy Vanderbilt were in complete agreement on this point, and their agreement carried the force of law in polite circles. A woman who eloped was strictly forbidden from wearing a white wedding gown or a veil. This was not a suggestion. It was a rule with teeth. The white gown and veil were symbols that belonged to a church ceremony, to a public declaration made before a community of witnesses. To wear them before a justice of the peace in a county courthouse was considered not merely inappropriate but actively dishonest, a misrepresentation of what was actually taking place. What the eloping bride wore instead was called a going-away suit, and it was a precise thing. A tailored daytime suit in a wool blend, cut to fit correctly and pressed to perfection. A smart hat, worn properly, not tilted at an angle for effect. Gloves, always gloves, in a color that coordinated with the suit. And a corsage, which was the one concession to occasion, the single detail that said, "This is not an ordinary Tuesday," without announcing anything more specific than that. The going-away suit was not a lesser version of a wedding dress. It was its own category, with its own dignity, and a well-dressed woman understood the difference. If you want to see the going-away suit rule in its most famous real-world application, you need only look at what Marilyn Monroe wore on January 14, 1954, when she married Joe DiMaggio at San Francisco City Hall. She did not wear white. She wore a dark brown broadcloth suit with an ermine collar, and she carried 3 white orchids. Not a bouquet, not a cascade of roses. 3 orchids. The restraint was the point. Everything about that outfit communicated that Marilyn Monroe knew exactly what the occasion required and had dressed for it with precision. She was not a girl playing dress-up. She was a woman following a code. The DiMaggio-Monroe elopement became, in retrospect, the era's clearest blueprint for how a high-profile runaway bride was supposed to conduct herself. And what is striking when you look at it closely is how thoroughly Marilyn followed the unspoken rules of the day. The dark suit instead of white. The small, specific floral gesture instead of a bridal bouquet. The city hall instead of a church. Every choice she made aligned with what Vanderbilt and Post would have prescribed for a woman of her station who had chosen to marry outside the traditional ceremony. She was famous for breaking rules. On this particular day, she followed every one of them. The corsage deserves its own moment because it was doing more work than it appeared to be doing. A corsage was not a wedding accessory. It was a daytime occasion accessory, worn to luncheons, to graduations, to civic ceremonies of all kinds. Pinning one to your lapel on the day you eloped communicated something very specific to anyone who understood the visual language of the era. This woman is marking a significant occasion. It signaled celebration without announcing bridal status. It was a way of saying something important is happening today without inviting questions about what exactly that important thing was. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. The handbag was equally communicative, and a well-raised woman of the 1950s understood this completely. A faux crocodile bag in the early 1950s was a specific social signal. It was the aspirational middle-class version of a luxury accessory, polished and structured and serious. It said, "This woman has standards," without saying, "This woman has money." The bag you carried told people something about your upbringing, your attention to detail, and your understanding of what an occasion required. An eloping bride who showed up to a courthouse with a careless or inappropriate bag was making a statement she almost certainly did not intend to make. No respectable woman appeared before a justice of the peace bareheaded. This was not a personal preference. It was a rule that applied to any formal civic encounter, and a marriage ceremony, however informal its setting, was a formal civic encounter. The hat in the 1950s was not merely a fashion accessory, it was a marker of seriousness and intention. To appear without one at a courthouse was the equivalent of arriving at a formal dinner without a jacket. It communicated that you did not understand what the occasion was, or worse, that you understood and did not care. The eloping bride who wore her hat correctly was telling everyone in that room that she respected what was happening, even if she had chosen to do it quietly. There was one more detail about the gloves that carried its own precise rule, and it is the kind of detail that reveals just how carefully choreographed the elopement was expected to be. A woman kept her gloves on for the entirety of the ceremony, right up until the moment the ring was to be placed on her finger. At that precise moment, and not before, she removed the glove from her left hand. Just the left hand. The right glove stayed on. After the ring was placed, she did not put the left glove back on over the ring. She held it, or tucked it, or passed it to her companion. The ring was meant to be seen. The gloves were meant to frame it. Not every runaway bride pointed her car toward Las Vegas. Some aimed for a quieter destination entirely. In the early 1950s, certain small American towns had quietly become the elopement capitals of the country, and they earned that title through one simple advantage: no waiting period, no blood test requirement, and a courthouse that opened its doors without asking too many questions. These were the Gretna Greens of America, named after the famous Scottish border town where runaway couples had fled for centuries. Elkton, Maryland, and Yuma, Arizona, were the two most famous, and both towns knew exactly what business they were in. Elkton, Maryland had been marrying runaway couples since the 1920s, and by the early 1950s, the local economy had quietly organized itself around the trade. When the overnight train from New York or Philadelphia pulled into the Elkton station, local taxi drivers were already waiting on the platform. They charged a flat fee, perhaps $2 or $3, and the route was always the same: straight to the Cecil County Courthouse, then to one of the town's several wedding chapels, then back to the station in time for the return train. The whole transaction could be completed in under 2 hours. The drivers knew the drill better than most ministers did. Out west, Las Vegas offered its own version of the same convenience, though with considerably more neon. The Little Church of the West opened in 1942 on the Las Vegas Strip, and by the early 1950s, it had become the most famous wedding chapel in America. The chapel fee ran between $10 and $15. The building itself was a modest wooden structure with white clapboard siding and a small bell tower, deliberately designed to look like a frontier church rather than a gambling hall. Couples who wanted the speed of Las Vegas but still needed to feel that the ceremony carried some dignity could walk through those doors and find exactly that. The price was low. The intention was not. Here is a detail that surprises people. The paperwork was the bride's responsibility. A well-prepared runaway bride of the 1950s arrived at the courthouse carrying her own birth certificate, proof of age, and any prior divorce decree if applicable. She did not expect the groom to manage these documents, and she did not expect the county clerk to wait while she searched her handbag. The marriage license itself cost $5 in most states during the early 1950s, and it had to be obtained before any ceremony could begin. A bride who showed up without her documents was not just unprepared. She was, by the standards of the day, embarrassing herself and her family even in absentia. Once the ceremony was done, the clock started. Not on the honeymoon, not on the champagne, but on the telegram. The most ironclad, unspoken rule governing the 1950s elopement was this: your parents heard it from you before they heard it from anyone else. A neighbor, a telephone operator, a society column reporter, a well-meaning cousin who spotted you at the courthouse, none of them were permitted to deliver this news first. That honor belonged to the bride alone. Failing to send word immediately was not simply rude. It was a betrayal that could permanently alter whether your family received the marriage as a fait accompli or as a public humiliation. A standard 15-word Western Union telegram in the early 1950s cost between 50 and 75 cents. That price ceiling meant every single word was deliberate. There was no room for sentiment, no space for apology, and certainly no room for explanation. A well-raised bride understood that the telegram was not the place to justify herself. It was the place to state a fact and to state it first. She counted her words the way a poet counts syllables, not because she was being cold, but because she understood that brevity in this moment was a form of respect. She was giving her parents information, not asking for their opinion. The wording itself followed a recognizable pattern that any well-raised daughter understood instinctively. Something close to this: Robert and I were married today in Las Vegas. Stop, please know we are very happy. Stop, letter follows. Stop, your loving Jane. 14 words. A fact. An emotional reassurance. A promise of more information to come. And a closing that reminded her parents she was still their daughter. What was conspicuously absent was any apology for the manner of the marriage, any request for forgiveness, and any explanation of why a church wedding had not taken place. The telegram announced it did not negotiate. The timing was not a suggestion. Etiquette of the era held that the telegram had to be dispatched within 1 hour of the ceremony concluding, not after the celebratory dinner, not after checking into the hotel, within the hour. This rule existed because small-town America in the 1950s moved information at a speed that modern people consistently underestimate. A courthouse clerk might mention the marriage to his wife over lunch. A taxi driver might know the bride's family. A florist who sold the corsage might recognize a last name. The 1-hour rule was not paranoia. It was a precise calculation of how fast news traveled in a world without social media, but with very attentive neighbors. Some brides chose the telephone instead of the telegram, and there were legitimate reasons to do so. A telephone call was faster, warmer, and gave a mother the chance to hear her daughter's voice before the shock fully settled. But there was a real risk to the telephone that the telegram did not carry. In the early 1950s, most residential telephone lines were party lines, meaning 2 or more households shared the same circuit. A neighbor could pick up her receiver and quietly listen to the entire conversation. The telegram, by contrast, went directly to the recipient and was delivered by a Western Union messenger to the front door. The content stayed private. For a family with any social standing at all, the telegram was often the safer choice. Once the telegram had been sent and received, the next battleground was the Sunday newspaper. In post-war American towns, the social announcements column was read with the same attention that people today give to social media feeds. And the wording of an elopement announcement carried a verdict that every neighbor could decode at a glance. If the announcement read, "Mr. and Mrs. John Smith announced the marriage of their daughter Jane," society understood instantly that the parents had chosen to claim the marriage as their own. The girl was forgiven. The family was intact. But if the announcement read, "Miss Jane Smith announces her marriage to," the message was equally clear. She had been cut off. The parents were not standing behind her. Do not underestimate what that Sunday paper meant in practice. In a town of any size in 1950s America, the social column was not background noise. It was the official record. Families who had lived in the same county for 2 or 3 generations understood that what appeared in that column was, for all practical purposes, the community's verdict on your family's standing. A neighbor reading, "Mr. and Mrs. John Smith announce over her morning coffee," would nod and think, "Well, they handled it." A neighbor reading, "Miss Jane Smith announces," would set down her cup and think, "Oh." The difference between those two reactions was the difference between a daughter who came home for Christmas and one who did not. The mother of the bride was the architect of the announcement, and this was no small task. She had to craft wording that saved face without lying, that acknowledged the marriage without endorsing the manner of it, and that communicated to the community that the family remained unified and composed. She did this while managing her own private feelings about what had happened, which were rarely simple. She consulted no therapist. She called no crisis hotline. She sat down at her writing desk, chose her words with the precision of a lawyer drafting a contract, and submitted the announcement to the paper before anyone could submit a rumor. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. Here is something the elopement etiquette books made absolutely clear, and that modern people find genuinely startling. The bride who eloped had surrendered her right to expect wedding gifts. Not her right to receive them, but her right to expect them. Friends and family could send a gift if they chose to, and many did out of genuine affection. But the eloping couple was strictly forbidden from hinting, suggesting, registering at a department store, or in any way signaling that gifts were anticipated. The bridal shower, that beloved pre-wedding ritual of the 1950s homemaker's social calendar, was entirely off the table. You chose the quick courthouse. You gave up the silver punch bowl. The distinction between receiving and expecting was not a minor one in the social code of post-war America. It was the difference between grace and greed. A friend who mailed a small gift to the newlywed couple was performing an act of personal generosity, freely given. The couple accepted it with a handwritten thank you note sent within 2 weeks, no exceptions. But if that same couple had registered at Marshall Field's, or if the bride's mother had dropped hints at the garden club, the entire transaction became something else entirely. It became a demand dressed as a celebration. And in the etiquette universe of 1952, that was a far greater social offense than the elopement itself had been. Think about what that actually meant in daily life for a young woman of the early 1950s. The bridal shower was not merely a party. It was the moment when a woman's community formally equipped her for homemaking. Friends and aunts brought the Sunbeam Mixmaster, the set of Pyrex mixing bowls, the monogrammed linen guest towels. These were practical objects, and they were expensive by the standards of a young couple just starting out. The eloping bride went without all of it. She set up her first kitchen with whatever she and her husband could afford on their own. The community's generosity had been forfeited, along with the white dress and the church pews. The math of elopement was never just about the chapel fee. Everything we have covered so far applies to the bride who ran away to marry in secret. She followed rules, yes, but she came home with a husband and a future. Now we turn to the harder story, the bride who canceled. The woman who stood at the edge of the ceremony looked at what was waiting for her and said no. In the 1950s, this was not a moment of feminist liberation. It was a social catastrophe of the first order, and it came with its own rigid, precise, and utterly unemotional protocol. The etiquette around a canceled wedding was, if anything, more exacting than the etiquette around a secret one, because now there was nothing to celebrate. There was only damage to contain. The canceled wedding was not a new problem in 1950s America, but the post-war era had developed a particularly precise and unsentimental response to it. Where earlier generations might have wept publicly or written long explanatory letters to everyone on the guest list, the 1950s bride who canceled was expected to do something that required far more discipline. Nothing visible, no scene, no explanation, no tears in public. The protocol that Amy Vanderbilt and Emily Post had codified by the early 1950s was built on a single organizing principle. Composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the highest form of dignity a woman in crisis could offer the people around her. To understand why the 1950s canceled wedding protocol was purely social rather than legal, you have to go back a few decades. In the 1920s and 1930s, breach of promise lawsuits were genuinely common. A jilted party, male or female, could sue for emotional damages, and courts sometimes awarded substantial sums. These cases were tabloid gold and social dynamite. But through the 1930s and into the 1940s, most American states passed what were called heart bomb acts, specifically designed to take the courts out of the business of adjudicating broken hearts. By the time Amy Vanderbilt published her complete book of etiquette in 1952, the legal threat was largely gone. What remained was something the law could not touch, the community's long memory. When the legal consequences evaporated, the social consequences did not fill the vacuum quietly. They filled it with interest. The punishment for a canceled wedding in 1950s, America was entirely social, and anyone who has lived inside a tight-knit community knows that social punishment can be far more enduring than a court judgment. A fine gets paid and forgotten. A reputation follows a woman to every church supper, every PTA meeting, every neighborhood block party for years afterward. The women who designed the cancellation protocol understood this perfectly. The rules they followed were not about suppressing emotion for its own sake. They were a calculated strategy for survival in a world where your standing in the community was your most practical asset. The first and most non-negotiable obligation of the canceled bride was the return of the engagement ring. Emily Post was unambiguous on this point in her 1958 edition. The ring went back to the groom. No exceptions, no negotiations, no keeping it as compensation for emotional suffering. The ring was not a gift in the ordinary sense. It was a symbol of a promise, and when the promise ended, the symbol returned to the person who had offered it. This was not merely etiquette. In many states, it was still the legal standard as well. A woman who kept the ring after canceling the engagement was not just ill-bred. She was, in the eyes of her community, something considerably worse. Emily Post was not a woman who trafficked in sentiment when sentiment would only make things worse. Her 8th edition, published in 1950, was precise on this point. Every wedding gift had to be returned. Every single one. Not the ones you liked least, not just the duplicates. Every gift that had arrived in anticipation of a wedding that would not happen had to be repacked, rewrapped, and sent back to the person who sent it, accompanied by a brief, handwritten note. No exceptions were carved out for close family. No allowance was made for items that had already been used or opened. The rule was absolute because the rule was the point. Consider what that actually meant in practice. A Gorham sterling silver place setting in 1954 retailed for approximately $35, which is the equivalent of a full week's grocery budget for a young family. It arrived in a velvet-lined box, engraved perhaps with initials that now belonged to a future that no longer existed. The bride's mother would have to locate the original wrapping, find the sender's address from the gift register, compose a note that said almost nothing while communicating everything, and then carry that box to the post office. Multiply that errand by every gift on the registry. The sheer physical labor of a canceled wedding was staggering. There was one errand that stood apart from all the others in its particular quiet indignity. A mother and her daughter would have to walk into the bridal registry department of a store like Lord & Taylor or Marshall Field's, approach the counter where they had once stood with such anticipation, selecting china patterns and linen sets, and explain to the sales clerk that the registry needed to be closed. The gifts that had been purchased through the store had to be processed for return. The clerk knew. The floor manager knew. The woman at the perfume counter who glanced over knew, and not one word beyond what was strictly necessary was spoken by either the mother or the daughter. What made that errand bearable, and what made it a test of everything a woman had been raised to be, was the absolute requirement that no scene be made, no tears in the elevator, no trembling voice at the counter, no visible sign that this was anything other than a routine administrative task. The 1950s did not ask a woman to feel nothing. They asked her to feel everything privately and present nothing publicly. That distinction is one that the modern world has almost entirely lost, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because there was a genuine mercy in it for the woman herself. The errand ended. She walked out. The world moved on because she had not given it a reason to linger. The printed cancellation card was its own small masterpiece of restraint. It was not a letter. It was not a telegram in most cases, though telegrams were permitted when time was desperately short. It was a formal printed card, ordered from the same stationer who had printed the wedding invitations, and it was mailed to every single person on the original guest list. The cardstock matched. The font matched. The return address matched. Everything about it communicated that this household had not lost its composure, had not lost its standing, and was handling an unfortunate situation with exactly the dignity that its name required. The card itself was the message before a single word was read. The no explanations rule was perhaps the most counterintuitive instruction a 1950s mother ever gave her daughter, and it was also the most psychologically sophisticated. When a wedding was canceled, the bride was explicitly and firmly taught never to explain why. Not to her friends, not to her neighbors, not to the women at her church, not in the card, not in any follow-up conversation, not even in the vaguest possible terms. The reasoning behind this rule was elegant in its logic. Any explanation you offered became a story that could be retold, embellished, disputed, and weaponized. Silence, by contrast, could not be argued with. Silence left nothing for the gossips to sharpen their teeth on. The exact wording on the mother's printed cancellation card was studied and deliberate. Amy Vanderbilt and Emily Post both provided model language, and the standard formulation ran something like this. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Smith announce that the marriage of their daughter Jane to Mr. Robert Holloway will not take place. That was the entirety of it. No date was given for when the cancellation was decided. No reason was offered. No regret was expressed in print, because expressing regret in print would have invited questions about what, precisely, there was to regret. The passive construction, will not take place, was chosen with care. It named no one as the party who had walked away. Brevity was dignity. That was the operating principle behind every element of the cancellation protocol, and it is a principle worth saying plainly because it runs so contrary to how the modern world handles public difficulty. In the 1950s, the fewer words a woman used in a crisis, the more composure was assumed of her. A long explanation read as panic. A short, formal statement read as control. The women who understood this best were the ones who had watched their own mothers navigate hard moments with a stillness that seemed almost supernatural. It was not supernatural. It was trained. It was practiced. It was a skill that was passed down in kitchens and parlors, not written in any book. When time was genuinely short, when the wedding was days away rather than weeks, and the printed cards could not be produced and mailed in time, etiquette permitted the telegram as a substitute. Western Union was equipped for exactly this kind of social emergency. A mother could walk into any Western Union office and send a message to each household on the guest list, though the cost added up quickly at 50 to 75 cents per 15-word message. The wording of the telegram followed the same iron principle as the printed card. Formal, brief, passive, and completely without explanation. The telegram's impersonal nature was not a flaw in this context. It was a feature. It kept the transaction clean. The Groom's family occupied a particular and often overlooked position in this protocol, and etiquette was precise about what was expected of them. They received the same printed card as every other guest on the list. They were expected to respond to it with the same silence they would extend to any other family navigating a private difficulty. The groom's mother was not permitted to telephone the bride's mother and demand answers. The groom's father was not permitted to make statements to neighbors. The code of silence extended to both households equally, and any family that broke it by gossiping or demanding explanations was immediately identified by polite society as the party that had behaved badly, regardless of who had actually ended the engagement. What the canceled bride wore in the days immediately following the announcement was not a trivial consideration. It was, in fact, a statement. She did not go into hiding. She did not stop appearing at church, at the market, or at any social engagement she had previously committed to attending. She appeared, and she appeared well-dressed. A tailored day dress, proper shoes, gloves if the occasion called for them, hair set. The message her appearance sent to every woman who saw her was the same message the card had sent. This household is intact. This woman is intact, and if you were hoping to see evidence of collapse, you will find none here. The clothes were armor, and every woman who saw her understood exactly what they were for. The rule against visible grief in public was one of the most demanding things the 1950s asked of its women, and it is the one that modern audiences are perhaps most likely to misread as cruelty. It was not a denial of grief. It was a containment of it. A canceled bride was understood to be suffering. Her mother knew it. Her closest friends knew it. The etiquette books did not pretend otherwise. What they insisted upon was that the suffering belonged at home, behind closed doors, in the company of women who loved her. It did not belong at the grocery store, at the church social, or at any public place where displaying it would transform her private pain into public entertainment for people who had no right to it. The social rehabilitation timeline for a canceled bride was understood by every woman in her community, even though no one ever published it as a numbered list. It moved in roughly 3 stages. In the first weeks, she appeared only at obligations: church, essential errands, family commitments. She did not attend parties or social gatherings, not because she was forbidden to, but because appearing too quickly at a festive event would have read as either callousness or performance. In the second month, she might accept a quiet dinner invitation from a close family friend. By the third or fourth month, if she had conducted herself with consistent composure, she was considered to have earned her way back into the full social calendar. The community watched, and the community kept score. The mother of a canceled bride carried a burden that etiquette books acknowledged, but rarely spelled out in full. She became her daughter's public spokesperson, her social shield, and the primary manager of the family's reputation, all simultaneously. When neighbors asked questions that crossed the line, it was the mother who deflected them with a phrase so practiced it sounded effortless. When the church circle wanted to know what had happened, the mother was the one who smiled and changed the subject so smoothly that the other woman barely noticed. She absorbed the social pressure so that her daughter did not have to absorb it alone. This was not a small thing. This was a full-time, unpaid, invisible job that lasted for months. What a woman's friends were permitted to say to a canceled bride was a narrow and carefully navigated channel. The acceptable phrases were few, and the good ones were very good. "I am so sorry you are going through this" was acceptable. "We are all here for you" was acceptable. "You do not have to talk about it" was not only acceptable, but often the most generous thing a friend could say, because it released the canceled bride from the obligation to perform an explanation she had been specifically instructed not to give. A truly well-bred friend understood that her job was to make the canceled bride feel less alone without making her feel interrogated, and that required a kind of social intelligence that not everyone possessed. What friends were absolutely forbidden to ask was equally well understood, even if it was never written on a list and handed out at the door. You did not ask who had ended the engagement. You did not ask whether there had been a fight, an indiscretion, a change of heart, or a discovery of some kind. You did not ask whether the bride was all right in a tone that implied you suspected she was not. You did not ask what was going to happen to the dress. You did not ask whether the groom had already moved on. Every one of these questions, however natural they might have felt to ask, was understood to be a breach of the social compact. Asking them marked you as someone who valued gossip over loyalty, and that was not a reputation any well-raised woman wanted to carry. The social treatment of the eloping bride and the canceled bride differed in ways that reveal exactly what the 1950s valued most. The eloping bride had committed an act of impatience and perhaps selfishness, but she had committed it in the direction of marriage, which the era considered the correct destination for a young woman. Her transgression was procedural. She had skipped the ceremony, not the institution. The canceled bride, by contrast, had rejected the destination entirely, at least for now, and that made her transgression feel more fundamental to a society that organized itself around the assumption that every young woman's life was moving toward a wedding. The community's response to each reflected that distinction with remarkable precision. The eloping bride could be forgiven, and in most cases she was, particularly if her parents managed the newspaper announcement correctly, and the couple presented themselves well at the family dinner that followed within a reasonable number of weeks. The forgiveness was not instant, and it was not unconditional, but it was available. The canceled bride had a longer road. She had not simply bypassed the ceremony, she had disrupted the social planning, the financial investment, the community's emotional anticipation, and the groom's public standing all at once. Earning her way back required sustained, visible composure over a period of months, not weeks. The community was watching to see whether she understood the weight of what she had done, and her behavior was the only answer she was permitted to give. Here is the counterintuitive grace at the center of all these cancellation rules, and it is worth saying clearly because it is the thing that gets lost when modern audiences look at this era and see only restriction. These rules protected the canceled bride, every single one of them. The no explanations rule protected her from having to publicly defend a private decision. The composure requirement protected her from being remembered as the woman who fell apart. The rehabilitation timeline protected her from being rushed back into social situations before she was ready. The mother's role as spokesperson protected her from having to face the community alone. The rules were not designed to punish her. They were designed to give her a path through a very hard thing with her dignity still attached. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. That is the sentence that keeps returning when you spend time with these codes, because it captures something true about how they worked. They were not enforced by law after the Heart Balm Acts cleared the courts of breach of promise suits. They were not enforced by any official body. They were enforced by the shared understanding of every woman who had been raised in the same tradition, who had watched her own mother navigate the same situations, and who understood that the invisible architecture of these rules was the thing standing between a difficult moment and a complete social unraveling. The knowledge was transmitted person to person, generation to generation, in kitchens and parlors and quiet conversations that nobody thought to record. These rules were never printed in a school textbook. No teacher stood at a chalkboard and explained what a canceled bride owed the world in terms of silence and composure. The transmission happened in kitchens, on front porches, in hushed conversations between a mother and a daughter the week before a wedding. An aunt might pull a girl aside at a family dinner and say 3 quiet sentences that contained everything she would ever need to know. That was the entire curriculum. That was enough. If a woman did not have a mother or aunt to guide her, she had the magazines. The Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping were not simply publications about recipes and curtain fabric. They were the informal enforcement arm of American etiquette, month after month, issue after issue. Columns like "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" and letters to advice editors filled in the gaps that no mother had thought to cover. A woman could read a scenario about a canceled engagement in the August 1953 issue of Good Housekeeping and know exactly what was expected of her before she ever faced it herself. Then came the 1960s, and the codes began to loosen stitch by stitch. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a hem unravels, one thread at a time. What disappeared first was not the big dramatic rule. What disappeared first was the small, precise, load-bearing detail. The specific wording on the cancellation card, the 1-hour telegram window, the understanding that a corsage on a navy suit communicated something exact to a justice of the peace and to every witness in that room. Once those small precisions were gone, the larger structure had nothing left to rest on. The going-away suit was one of the first casualties. By the mid-1960s, fashion magazines were celebrating brides who eloped in peasant blouses and bare sandals, and the etiquette books that had once called the tailored daytime suit non-negotiable were quietly revised or simply stopped being printed. The wool suit, the smart hat, the gloves removed at precisely the right moment during the ring exchange, all of it was declared stuffy and irrelevant. What nobody said out loud was that Stuffy and Irrelevant had been doing a great deal of quiet work on behalf of the women who wore them. And then the shame around a canceled wedding evaporated too, and with it went the entire protective architecture that had surrounded it. In the 1950s, the no explanations rule, the printed card, the mother as public spokesperson, the social rehabilitation timeline, all of those structures existed precisely because a canceled wedding was treated as a serious event that required serious management. When the cultural shame disappeared, the management disappeared with it. Nobody thought to ask what would replace the structure. It turned out nothing did. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. What was lost when these rules disappeared was not restriction. These women were not liberated from the rules the way we sometimes like to tell the story. What was lost was a shared language, a language in which every person in the room understood what the navy suit meant, what the telegram meant, what the printed card with no apology meant. A language in which dignity had a grammar and composure had a vocabulary. When the language went, the women who had spoken it fluently were left holding words that nobody around them recognized anymore. Think about what happens today when a wedding is canceled close to the date. There is no agreed-upon script. The couple may post something on social media or say nothing at all. Guests find out through a text chain or a mutual friend. The gifts may or may not be returned, and there is no printed card, no wording, no protocol that tells anyone what they are supposed to do next. The people caught in the middle have no guidance and no shared understanding of what is expected of them. The 1950s bride who canceled her wedding had a painful experience, but she had a map. Today, there is no map. I think about what a woman like Amy Vanderbilt would make of the modern public breakup announcement, the kind posted on social media with a photograph and a lengthy caption explaining every grievance and every feeling in real time for an audience of hundreds or thousands. Vanderbilt's entire philosophy rested on one principle: the fewer people who know the details of your private pain, the more dignity you retain. The announcement was not about hiding the truth. It was about understanding that your worst moment does not owe itself to an audience. That idea has not aged. It has simply been forgotten. There's a quiet argument hiding in all of this, and I want to make it plainly. Brevity, composure, and the deliberate refusal to offer a public explanation still work in 2026. Not because they are old-fashioned, but because they are psychologically sound. When you say nothing beyond what is necessary, you give other people nothing to argue with and nothing to pity. The 1950s runaway bride who sent a 15-word telegram and then said nothing further was not suppressing herself. She was protecting herself with the most elegant tool available: restraint. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. She knew that a scandal handled quietly is a scandal that ends. She knew that the woman who makes no scene at the market on Tuesday is the woman the neighborhood has forgotten about by Thursday. She knew that composure is not the same as weakness and that silence is not the same as shame. She carried that knowledge in the set of her shoulders and the wording of a card she sent without a single word of apology. And she carried it so naturally that she probably never thought to explain it to anyone. That was the loss. Not the rule itself, but the conversation that never happened. Here is the enduring lesson underneath all of these rules, the one that connects the telegram wording and the going away suit and the printed cancellation card and the gloves removed at precisely the right moment. Every single one of these rules was designed to protect the woman who followed them, not to protect the room, not to protect appearances for their own sake, to protect her, to give her a structure that held her upright during the moments when she might otherwise have fallen apart in public. The rules were the architecture. The woman walking through them was the point. You do not have to live in the 1950s to use what these women knew. You do not have to wear white gloves or send a Western Union telegram. What you can take from these codes is the underlying principle that how you handle a difficult moment is itself a statement about who you are. That brevity is a form of grace. That composure in public is not dishonesty about your private feelings. That choosing not to explain yourself to people who were not owed an explanation is not weakness. It is a skill. These women had it, and they carried it quietly, and it is worth picking back up. The women we have been talking about today were smarter and more intentional than history usually remembers them being. They were not simply following orders handed down from Emily Post or Amy Vanderbilt. They were operating within a system they understood deeply, a system that gave them tools for the hardest moments of their social lives and asked them to use those tools with precision. They did. A navy wool suit and a 15-word telegram, and a printed card with no apology, and gloves removed at exactly the right moment. That is not naivety. That is craft. And the world that discarded it did not replace it with anything nearly as useful. If this episode felt like something worth saving, I hope you will subscribe to Clara's Forgotten Manners so you never miss what we uncover next. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Did anyone in your family elope? Did your mother or grandmother ever mention the going away suit or the telegram or the rules around a canceled engagement? Those stories are exactly why this channel exists, and I read every single one. Next week, we are going deep into the forgotten rules of the post-war calling card, and I promise you, there is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore.